got excited there. Made me feel young again. Good job. Boy, that was powerful. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. It's good to see the turnout. It's really not surprised, but very grateful when we came around the corner and saw the parking lot. It was full from end to end. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Everett Jordan. I'll introduce you in a second, but thanks for making the drive here and joining us today. It's your second time understanding at APG. Been a long time. And you work in the DC area, and I'll mention that later on, but when you get back, try to keep this a secret here. I know where you work, you know how to keep secrets. It's kind of your trade. We like what we've got going on here. It's a very special place. Many, many reasons. I mean, just the natural beauty of the place alone. Not to mention the people, but it's the beauty here. We've got more bald eagles. Everybody hears me talk about this all the time, than any other military installation in the continental United States.
That's where they're at.
They're already here. You want more, you have to go to Alaska. It gets cold here. But with 144 miles of shoreline on Chesapeake Bay, everyone here just has the requirement to be happy. So we have a great place to serve our fellow citizens here in the Army, and we welcome you. But please keep it secret. You know, right around the corner here, the next town, just beyond Aberdeen, is a place called Everette. And if it wasn't for one vote of Congress, Everette would have been our nation's capital. Yeah, you didn't know that. Look it up. So it came this close to this being the nation's capital. Imagine this beautiful place I'm describing, what it would have turned into by one vote. That's it. We wouldn't have these eagles and all this stuff I'm bragging about here. So welcome to my fellow commanders, Command Sergeant Major, the team APG here. Thank you all for coming today. We don't get enough opportunities to come together like this and just take a moment, and especially when we have a singular purpose with today's event, to unite us all. So this is really a special treat to come together with you. Now, if you work in CCOM, U.S. Army Communications Electronics Command, or I'm the Commanding General, you know I like sharing some historical anecdotes and use them to make my point, because there's really no better way to make your point than to tell a story, especially if it's a story about something that really happened, about people that actually live the point you're trying to make. And so last week I shared with the CCOM workforce this story I'm about to share with the rest of you. But first, many thanks to Mr. Bernard for reading Dr. King's speech that shook the collective consciousness of our nation. How about a round of applause for him? Now, what he read is credited with the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act the very next year after that speech was delivered by Dr. King. And it's widely considered the finest oration of the century. Now, I happen to be fortunate enough to be on the National Mall right there in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 2003, celebrating the 40th anniversary of I Have a Dream. And even then, back in 2003, it had impacted, reverberated in a profound way many years after its initial delivery. But the speech, the original speech on the mall, almost didn't happen. And this is the interesting part of the story. So if anyone's been to our nation's capital and you've been out on the mall, I think most of you have. If you haven't, I invite you to get out of the barracks. But it's huge, the National Mall there. And you can just marvel at how vast it is. And so put yourself back in the time, long before YouTube and Instagram and Jumbotrons. And think about the organizers that were organizing the event for Dr. King. And they knew the success of the event would depend on about 250,000 people on the mall being able to hear this Dr. King speech. So the organizers rented a state-of-the-art sound system back then, spent about $20,000 doing it, that's a lot of money, just to wire the mall with a PA system so everyone could hear. The cover was about a square mile there, with the crowds gathering. Now, It wasn't just the organizers that realized how important it was for the message to be understood clearly by the masses. Those who disagreed also realized how important that PA system was. So the night before the march, someone was intent on silencing Dr. King. So what happened the night before is he sneaked up and sabotaged the PA system, expertly sabotaged it, so it could not be easily fixed and used the next day. So when it was discovered, they alerted the contractor who they paid for the PA system, and he realized that he couldn't fix it in the 12 hours they had left until it was time for the event to kick off. So they quickly called the Attorney General at the time, Bobby Kennedy, and then what did he do? Well, he does whatever people in the jam do with really hard problems. And our nation needs help with the tough stuff. He called the Army. Yes, seriously. So Attorney General Bobby Kennedy called the Army. Now, of course, you know, I'm a little biased. And then the Army turned to the Signal Corps. So that's right, the Army said, "You Signal Corps, we need you to go fix this PA system." And the clock is ticking, and we only have a few hours left. So soon after, a team of signal engineers arrived, rolled up their sleeves in the National Mall, and they got to work, feverishly taking part in rebuilding that system piece by piece that had been sabotaged the night before. So again, being a Signal Corps man, I'm slightly biased, but imagine this. Imagine the crackle of the speakers that morning just before the event, when our U.S. Army Signal Corps repaired that. And the sound of it working, it must have sounded like angels from heaven just before the event was about to kick off. So, of course, I can't equate what the Army did in that moment and their small contribution to so many other courageous acts of the Civil Rights era, like Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in Montgomery, lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, and the Bloody March in Selma. But in our own way, the U.S. Army did live up to its sacred pledge to preserve our founding ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for all, regardless of our circumstances of birth, the size of your bank account, our religion, the color of your skin, any of those things. Those same things that Dr. King fought for. And to this day, our Army still continues to fight for. And that is why we, everyone here, and everyone at APG, must continue to fight for liberty, equality, and justice. So, this time, what I'd like to do is introduce Mr. Everett Jordan. He serves as the National Intelligence Manager for Economic Security and Threat Finance in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He plays a critical role in preserving the security of our nation and its financial systems. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you please help me welcome Mr. Everett Jordan.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be here today to speak to you on the occasion of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It is not often that we get the opportunity to come and speak on such an important topic on this day, so it's important to memorialize it. I'd like to start off with a few, I brought a slide presentation. I'd like to start off with a few family photos, if you don't mind. First slide, please. This slide was taken in February of 1964 at the Friendship Baptist Church in Pasadena, California. Dr. King was visiting this church, which happens to be the church I grew up in. He was visiting this church for the second time. He and the pastor of the church had been friends for many years, and so on this occasion he came to the church and he was posing with various members of the church. In this particular photo, he is posing and shaking hands with my mother. At the time, this photo cost $1 to buy. My mother was the only one who bought it, because she was the one shaking hands with Dr. King. Consider 1964. At that time, a gallon of gas cost about 16 cents. The good stuff cost 25 cents. A loaf of bread cost maybe 12 cents. Mom and Dad were both working and raising 6 kids. And so to spend $1 for a photograph required a discussion. And so mom and dad talked about it, and they decided, okay, since you're taking his hand, we'll go ahead and spend that dollar. And so this became one of our family photos for many years. Over the years, especially after Dr. King's death, other women in the group called my mother up and said, "You still have that picture?" And so she gave it out, and so all my brothers and sisters, there are 11 of us, all of us have a copy of this photo. Next slide, please. In 1991, Martin Luther King III came to the National Security Agency and spoke on MLK Day. And I took this opportunity to take the picture that you just saw and show it to him. And so what you see here is me showing him this picture, which he had never seen before, of our parents meeting and shaking hands back in 1964. I asked him to autograph this picture for my mother. And he did. So what you see here is him autographing that photograph for my mother, so I would get it out to her. And next slide, please. And then they took a picture of the two of us shaking hands, the same one our parents had all those years before. And so connection, yes. A moment, yes. You capture these things, you remember them, and you share them at the proper time to make sure that the connection stays good, the handshake stays strong from one generation to the next. Next slide, please. A philosophy teacher asks his students one day, "How can you tell when the sun is coming up again?" And so one of the students says, "Well, is it when dawn's first light hits the top of the trees?" The teacher says, "Well, that's a good answer." The second student brings in and says, "Perhaps it's when the first shadows appear on the ground." "That's possible," says the teacher. The third student adds, "It's obviously when you can feel the warmth of the sun even before you can see it." The teacher says, "Well, these are all good answers. But a rule of thumb that I have found, the best way to know when the sun is coming up again is when a man approaches a stranger and recognizes his brother." It's important that we recognize our brother or sister everywhere we go. We are all part of one family, and the resemblance is remarkable. Why do I tell you this story? Well, for me, it's one of those things that I believe underpin the idea of a day on versus a day off. The idea is to be in the spirit of service to someone that you would consider a stranger or someone in need. And in doing this service, you come to realize that this person is your brother or your sister. It's the spirit of compassion for the other that stirs within each of us, that leads us to take action, and sometimes not even giving it much thought. Has anybody here ever helped push somebody out of the snow? Yeah? See some hands. It had just snowed and you were walking along perhaps when you notice somebody is stuck and they're spinning their wheels. And so without another thought, you walk over and put your hands to the back of the vehicle or the side, and you help the driver give it the gas and get the vehicle moving. Now, momentum is important in the snow. And so once they get going, they really shouldn't stop. And so the driver, they wave to you, and you wave back at them. You head off in your direction, they head off in their direction. And in time, perhaps you even forgot that you even pushed them out. Now, here's some of the things that I think you didn't do. You didn't walk up and ask the person's name. You didn't ask who they voted for in the last election or what their party affiliation was. You didn't ask what they did for a living. And if they offered you money after the fact, you didn't take it. You saw the need and you responded. It might not have been a big deal to you, but it was certainly a big deal to them. And so how many here themselves have somebody pushed you out of the snow? Yeah. There are those days when it's you in need of help, and someone shows up and they get you going. And you are very thankful, very grateful. This is part of the day on, not a day off. It's a day to reflect about those things that we do for others that no one's begging us to, we're not ordered to, but we see the need and we respond immediately. You get to it, you get through it, you move on. Because people are brought into our lives at many different intersections, sometimes for a moment, sometimes for just a minute, and sometimes for a lifetime. And you thank God for all of those, things. The story is told about this preacher who goes to Alaska. He's looking to save some souls, and so he goes to where the souls are that need to be saved. He goes to a camp out there on the tundra, and with a lot of the guys that watch their dogs, and he's in the bar, because that's where everybody is, and he's preaching, and he says, when you're in trouble, you should call on God, and he will save you. And so there's a fellow sitting next to him and says, oh, preacher, I don't believe that at all. And the preacher turns to him and says, well, please explain. The guy says, well, I was running my team the other day. We got out there on the tundra. A storm came up. We got turned around and disoriented. I didn't know which way was up. So I called on God for help. And the preacher said, well, what happened next? The guy said, nothing happened. Some Eskimo showed up and led me back to camp. Sometimes we don't recognize the help that's coming. Even before we've asked for it, it's on its way. And sometimes when we render help, it doesn't seem to be appreciated or noticed. This should not discourage us from rendering help again. People will sometimes say it's the little things in life that make so much of a difference. In the world of service, light travels faster than sound. I mean to say that people will see what you do long before they hear what you have to say. In some cases, they may never hear what you have to say, but it was that thing that you did when you thought no one noticed. Like the way you helped a stranger up who had fallen, or helped a lost person find their way that made the difference. It might have been the way you sat with a person who was grieving. You couldn't think of what to say, they couldn't think of what to say, so you didn't say anything. You just sat there. You probably didn't realize that it meant the world to them that you showed up. Perhaps it's a memory of a kindness shown to you by a stranger, whether it's in this community or another community that now comes to mind that gives you warmth. To me, this is what a day on is all about. It's about focusing on those things that matter to us. Having said that, let me say this. People are weird. This may come as a shock, but yeah, people are weird. And sometimes it's difficult to relate to each other because of different backgrounds, different origins, or different cultures. Yet we find ourselves constantly in community with weird people, whether they are neighbors, friends, people we know from church, or co-workers. I know that in this military environment, it's not out of the ordinary to have somebody put an organization chart up. And so we are about to see one. Next slide. And I ask that you bear with me as we go through this slide presentation. Think of the, I took off all the names too, so I'm not calling anybody out. But consider electronic components and computer components for this as my organization. Next slide. First, you have your power source. Unless power is given to the circuit completely and continually in the way of information, the circuit does not work very well. Next slide. Next, you have your alternate power source. It thinks it can do everything the power source can do, but it can sometimes it's in limited duration and not always as effective. Next slide. Next, you have your fuses. These are those components in the organization which carry the heaviest load but tend to burn out real fast. Next slide. Then you've got your rectifiers. These components translate AC to DC. Next slide. Then you have your ROM. These are components that have been in the organization 1,000 years. You can't fire them. They know all the rules, all the regs. They will keep you out of jail or put you in jail. Next slide. Then you've got your RAM. These are the newer components of the organization. They're trainable, they're malleable. They can do some of this, and they can do some of that. Next slide. Then you have your capacitors. They store up lots of information and only give off little bits at a time. Next slide. Then you've got your diodes. They send information one direction, but not the other. Next slide. Then you have your transistors. Slightly older technology. They can still get the job done. They just need to be warmed up first. Next slide. Then you have your resistors. These components are born to do just one thing in life. Work against the flow of anything, come towards them, shut it down, slow it down, whatever. Next slide. Then you have your attenuators. They will not allow change to take place. They will shut it, they will either bring it up or shut it down. Next slide. Then you have your vacuum tubes. Ancient technology, no longer part of the main circuit, but they soak up a lot of energy and give off a lot of heat. Next slide. Then you've got your random charge. With everything else working just fine, the random charge comes in and touches any one of these components, blows the whole thing up. One thing about this circuit, it needs all of these components to work. They just need to be in the proper sequence. The negatives are also the positives. You can't have all the same type. You're not going to have all the same type. You guys work with these folks, you go to church, you meet them every day, and some of them are your friends, and they're weird, okay. But understand that this is my organization. I'm not sure what your organization is, sir. Some of you in the audience may be thinking, aha, I know him. But it's all right. There are all types of people in our communities, whether they're from your job, your church, your circle of friends, or those whose acquaintance you haven't met yet. All those differences are inconsequential when they're pushing you out of the snow, or you're pushing them out of the snow. Several years ago, I was on a flight from Nairobi. Next slide, please. Several years ago, I was on a flight from Nairobi, Kenya, to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. After boarding and making my way to my seat, a man about my age sits down next to me and he starts a conversation. And in the conversation, he realizes that I'm American, and he asks me this question. Next slide. Okay. He asks me this question and says, I have seen for decades you Americans seem to be willing to travel all around the world and fight in wars that are not your own to defend people you don't know. You spill your own blood for strangers. Why do you do that? I answered the question on two levels. I first responded directly to the question by saying that we are honoring a commitment that we made, or for a cause we as a country believe in. I added that there are times when this is required for the greater purpose, and therefore we go. I then told him that I was a young man from a large family with few monetary prospects of going to college, so I joined the Army and wanted to see the world and do what I could do. The man understood about being young and poor, and I was the first American he had had the chance to ask this question to, based on what he had seen over the years. He had seen Americans doing these things, and me being the first American to come across, he asked me the question, why do you guys do this? And so, I've not really shared this with a large group before, but I felt it was important to illustrate the idea that light travels faster than sound. Years may have gone by when something has taken place, someone noticed it, and then they have the opportunity to mention it. But it's the impressions that are given. Next slide, please. In 1990, I started out in the Army as a Russian linguist back in 1977, and had a lot of fun doing that, did that for a bunch of years. But in 1990, I got bored being a Russian linguist, so I became an Arabic linguist. I was young, I needed the money. And so, in doing that, one of the things that you, when you're learning the Arabic language, you not only learn the language, you also get to learn about Islam and how the religion is intertwined with the language. So I got to learn both. My teachers were Christian Arabs from the Middle East, and one of them had a PhD in Islamic studies. At the end of the first Gulf War, a friend of mine brought me a picture he had taken while out in the Iraqi desert, and this is what I'm showing to you now. What you're looking at is the inside of a foxhole in the Iraqi desert. Its occupant had scratched something in sand in the wall of the foxhole before the U.S. Army came by and liberated him. And so they took a picture of it. They wanted to know, what does he say? And so they brought it to me, and I will always be a student of language. They brought it to me, and they showed it to me. I said, well, okay, this is good. And I took it to my instructor, and he said, this is Quranic verse. And do we have Arabic speakers in the room? Good, I'm going to sound like a genius. All right. He said the first thing that you see when Arabic is read and written right to left instead of left to right. And so start on the right side of this slide at the top. The first thing you see is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. When you see that written, it tells you that the Quranic verse is going to follow. And so the next verse, there are two verses here. The first one says, "La yusibuna illa ma kataba lahu lana, huwa mu'lana wa alayhi falyatawakkal al-mu'minun," which means, say, nothing will happen to us except what God has foreordained. He is our protector, and in Him let the believers put their trust. The second verse is taken from the story of Joseph, when they have to send the youngest son to Egypt to see Joseph. And the father is reluctant about doing that, so he says to his sons, he says, well, وَأَلَّهُ خَيْرٌ حَافِظٌ وَهُوَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ, which means God is good to take care of him, and He is the most merciful of the merciful. And so this gives me an idea of the state of mind of the person who was inside that foxhole. They were calling on God for comfort, for grace, for peace, while the U.S. Army is advancing. This is important to know that in times of trouble, the people, for the faith that they have, will call on that. Now, as I was getting my master's degree in theology, I got to go to seminary, and I got to take lots of courses in comparative religions. And this works out well for me because I volunteer in the prisons in MLK County. I've been doing that for about 30 years, have a lot of fun. And from time to time, I get the opportunity to explain the difference between Christianity and Islam. The inmates want to know the difference. And so they have many people of different faiths inside the prisons. And so that bit of understanding is important. And so for me, I give the technical differences. I can explain how Christianity is, how Islam is, and it works out very well. But then I tell them, if you want to know what it means to be a Muslim, ask a Muslim. I'm Christian. I can tell you what it means to be a Christian. But if you really want to know, ask a Muslim. The things that you read about faith and commitment are not just found in the book, they are found in the heart. And so when you really want to know those things, when you want to gain that understanding, reach out and make that connection. So why do I mention all of this today? Next slide, please. I do so to acknowledge the existence of differences among many people in any community, but point out that the great things that can be done by that community are done not despite the differences, but because of them. In most communities, you will encounter people in need. And I'm not just talking about basic physical or monetary needs, but also spiritual needs, companionship, belonging, a sense that someone cares, a sense about feeling safe. And when we're talking about being on mission, it's important to let someone help you. It seems as though the thought is always for those of us who have, been blessed with the physical abilities, some monetary means, and opportunity to go out and help others. But it also comes back when we ourselves are in need. We have to be willing to let someone help us, to let someone reach out and provide for us in a way we were always used to providing for other people. And I may be talking to someone in the audience who perhaps is in need, but hasn't reached out to let anybody know that they need help. And today might be that day when you acknowledge that you do need help. Each of us has different gifts that we can plug in and meet the need as it's presented. So what do you do and where do you start? You do what you can and you start where you are. It's good doing it for specific reasons, but sometimes it's good doing it for no reason at all, other than the fact that you're thinking about something. This is a day on mission, when that mission is to feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, clothe those who are naked, provide shelter to the homeless, provide care through visitation or a letter or a phone call or email, encourage, support, fix, clean, build, protect, defend. Send a letter to someone or an email thanking them for something that they may have done for you a long time ago. Maybe you would pay for a stranger's lunch bill. Perhaps sending a card to someone who is grieving the loss of someone close to them. Even though it happened a long time ago, sending it now also helps. Push a stranger out of the snow and recognize your brother. This is what makes a community strong. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we would like to invite Major General Taylor, Command Sergeant Gutierrez, Miss Tracy Marshall to join Mr. Jordan center stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Major General General Taylor will now present to Mr. Jordan a token of appreciation for him joining us today.